Somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic, there is a sea that has no shore. No cliffs rise at its edge, no beaches mark where it begins or ends, no river mouths open into it, and no tide washes against rock at its border. And yet it is unmistakably a sea with its own identity, its own name, its own strange and ancient character. It is called the Sargasso Sea, and it is the only named sea on Earth defined not by land, but entirely by water moving around it. That is a remarkable thing to sit with for a moment. Every other sea you can name is shaped in part by coastlines, by continents leaning in, by the geometry of land holding water in place. The Sargasso has none of that. Its walls are currents, and its floor is open ocean, and the whole arrangement floats within the broader Atlantic like a slow spinning room with no ceiling and no door. Hello there, and welcome to Slumber Sea. Tonight we are drifting into one of the ocean's most quietly extraordinary places. If you are new here, I warmly invite you to subscribe and settle in, because there is much more of this kind of gentle exploring waiting for you. But for now, let your body soften into whatever is holding you and let the surface world begin to recede. The boundary of the Sargasso Sea is drawn by four ocean currents that together form the North Atlantic subtropical gyre, a slow clockwise rotation of water in the upper Atlantic. To the west, the Gulf Stream sweeps northward along the eastern coast of North America, carrying warm water at remarkable speed. To the North Atlantic current carries that warmth eastward toward Europe. To the east, the Canary Current flows southward along the coast of Africa, cooler and gentler, and to the south, the North Atlantic Equatorial Current completes the circle, flowing westward back across the Atlantic toward the Caribbean. Together, these four currents trace an elliptical enclosure stretching roughly between 20 and 35 degrees north latitude and 40 to 70 degrees west longitude, an area somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 million square kilometers. But here is what makes this arrangement so unusual. Those boundaries are not fixed, they breathe. The position of the Sargasso shifts with the seasons and with the behavior of the Azores High, a persistent region of atmospheric pressure that steers the currents themselves, so the sea does not have sharp lines you could draw on a map with confidence year after year. It has tendencies, a general region where the gyre gathers and holds, where its encircling walls slow the water inside to something close to stillness. It is a geographic anomaly with soft edges and no shore, a sea within a sea floating in open ocean, framed entirely by motion. What those currents create inside their enclosure is something worth pausing over, because when water is enclosed by a gyre, it does not move the way water in most ocean regions moves. It sits, it collects. It becomes remarkably clear, almost eerily blue, because nutrients are scarce and the biological turbulence that clouds other ocean surfaces is quieter here. Early sailors sometimes described it as a desert of the sea, and in one sense they were not entirely wrong, but they were also missing something. Floating on that still, clear surface, in enormous golden-brown mats, is a type of seaweed that grows nowhere else like this in the world. It does not root on the seafloor, it does not need a coast, it simply drifts, generation after generation, entirely at sea. And within those mats, whole communities of life have found a home, creatures shaped by millions of years of living on a raft with no anchor and no shore in sight. The sea that holds them is ancient and strange and full of processes that are still being understood. Beneath its calm surface, invisible forces are at work, cycling carbon, feeding microscopic communities, even hosting a world of viruses so numerous and so distinct from anything found elsewhere in the ocean that scientists who have studied them describe the findings as genuinely surprising. All of that begins here, in the simple and astonishing fact that this sea exists at all, defined by nothing but the turning of water around it, holding its secrets beneath a surface that looks from above like it is barely moving. To understand why the Sargasso Sea feels the way it does, it helps to spend a moment with the machinery that creates it. Four currents, each with its own character, its own speed, its own origin, circling in the same slow, clockwise direction until the water trapped inside becomes something almost separate from the rest of the Atlantic. That enclosure is the North Atlantic subtropical gyre, and the Sargasso Sea is what lives at its heart. The Gulf Stream is the western boundary, and it is anything but gentle. It moves northward along the American coast with a force and volume that makes it one of the strongest ocean currents on Earth. It is warm and fast and focused, more like a river running through the sea than a diffuse drift of water. To the North Atlantic current carries that warmth eastward across the upper Atlantic, spreading and slowing as it goes. Then the Canary Current turns the corner, moving southward along the eastern edge, cooler and more relaxed, running past the African coast with a quieter persistence. And finally, the North Atlantic equatorial current closes the loop, sweeping westward along the southern boundary, pulling water back toward the Caribbean to feed the Gulf Stream again. Each current is distinct. Together, they form a continuous circuit, and the water they enclose spins slowly at its center, like something left to rest. That spinning center is not still in the way. A pond is still, but compared to the vigorous flows that surround it, the interior of the gyre moves at a pace that feels almost motionless. Water that enters the enclosed region tends to stay there, circulating gently in long, slow loops that carry it around the center over the course of years rather than days. The boundary currents keep it contained, the interior drifts, and that difference in motion is what creates the Sargasso Sea's peculiar character. Most seas carry an implicit anchor in their definition. You can point to the coastlines, name the capes, trace the land that shapes the water. The Sargasso offers none of that. Its limits are the currents themselves, and currents are not fixed. They shift with the seasons. The Azores High, the great atmospheric pressure system that steers the winds and water of this part of the Atlantic, moves northward in summer and retreats somewhat in winter. As it shifts, the gyre responds. The boundaries drift a few degrees of latitude, the sea expanding in warmer months and contracting in cooler ones. The precise edges at any given time depend on which tools you use to measure them, whether you follow the temperature fronts visible from satellites, or track the atmospheric pressure that drives the winds, or simply observe where the water changes character. The Sargasso does not hold a fixed address, it holds a general location, and within that location it tends to be itself. What that self feels like is defined partly by what the gyre does to the water inside. Because the currents rotate around the center, they create a slight downwelling, pushing surface water gently downward into the interior. That downwelling keeps nutrient-rich water from deeper layers from rising to the surface. In most productive ocean regions, upwelling brings cold, nutrient-laden water up from below, feeding blooms of phytoplankton that turn the sea green and busy with life. The Sargasso is the opposite. The nutrients stay deep. The surface water is warm and clear and strikingly blue because there is not enough biological material floating in it to scatter the light. In the language of oceanography, this makes it oligotrophic, meaning low in nutrients, and by extension low in the kind of primary productivity that fuels dense food webs. Sailors crossing this region centuries ago noticed the quietness of the water and sometimes feared it, imagining it as a trap, a place where ships could be becalmed and held in place by the stillness. The reputation was exaggerated, but the observation behind it was real. The winds above the gyre center are often light. The surface lacks the chop and energy of the surrounding ocean. In comparison to the dynamic, turbulent seas on its periphery, the interior of the Sargasso can feel muted and suspended, as though time runs differently there. And in a sense it does. With low nutrient supply and little of the seasonal turbulence that reshapes other ocean regions, the Sargasso maintains a kind of consistency that most ocean places do not have. There are brief exceptions. In winter, when surface waters cool and the difference in temperature between the surface and the depths below decreases, convective mixing can stir things up and inject nutrients from below, sparking modest phytoplankton blooms that do not last long. But these pulses are temporary, and the general condition returns. The surface is warm, the nutrients are held below, and the water above settles back into its quiet, high salinity drift. That warmth and saltiness have their own rhythm. Evaporation in the gyre is high and precipitation is low, which means water leaves the surface more readily than it arrives, leaving behind a surface layer that is saltier and warmer than much of the surrounding Atlantic. This makes the Sargasso unusually transparent. Its water some of the clearest and bluest in the world, brilliant in a way that can feel almost austere. What lives in a place like this must find a way to manage with less nutrient, less biological turbulence, less of the constant mixing that fuels life in richer seas. The creatures and organisms that have made this place their home have adapted to the oligotrophic reality in ways that are still being studied. Some have become remarkably efficient, some have formed partnerships, and some, like the great drifting mats of seaweed that give the sea its name, have turned the very stillness that might seem limiting into the foundation of something extraordinary. The seaweed arrives slowly into view as you drift toward it. From a distance it looks like a stain on the water, a smear of brown and gold against the deep blue, irregular at its edges and thicker toward the middle. Come closer and the stain resolves into texture, into fronds and air bladders and trailing tendrils, into something that has the structure of a living canopy rather than the flatness of debris. This is Sargassum, and in the Sargasso Sea it has been drifting, growing and sheltering life longer than almost any other floating habitat on the planet. There are two species doing most of the work here, Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans, both brown algae, both holopelagic, which means they spend their entire lives at sea, never anchoring to a rock or a reef, never touching the seafloor. Most seaweed needs something solid to hold on to. These two species have abandoned that requirement entirely. They drift freely, reproducing not by releasing spores that need to settle on substrate, but by fragmenting, breaking off pieces of themselves that float away and grow into new plants. A mat can expand and divide and reassemble without ever making contact with land or bottom. The ocean is both their home and their medium, and they have made it work for what may be millions of years. An estimated 7 million tons of this algae drifts through the Sargasso at any given time, though that figure carries uncertainty and should be held loosely. What is certain is the scale of what you see when you encounter a large mat. It can stretch for miles, edge connecting to edge, frond overlapping frond, creating a surface layer that has weight and shadow and structure. The individual air bladders, small round floats that keep the plant suspended just below or at the surface, catch the light and give the mat a texture like cobblestones seen through shallow water. Up close, each one looks like a tiny glass bead. Collectively, they turn the plant into something buoyant and purposeful, a living raft that does not need a hull. Beneath the mat, something changes. The water is still the same deep blue. It was a few meters away, but the light that reaches it is filtered and dappled, broken into shifting shafts by the canopy above. Scientists and divers who have swum beneath large sargassum aggregations describe the experience as being bathed in golden amber light, the fronds swaying overhead like the ceiling of a warm forest. The visual effect is of depth and shelter, of enclosed space in an environment that otherwise has no walls. In open ocean, where the water column extends for kilometers in every direction and there is nothing to hide behind or cling to, this single layer of vegetation becomes something enormous. It functions like a rainforest in a desert. The comparison is not just poetic. In a nutrient-poor pelagic environment, where the surrounding water column offers almost no structure and very little concentrated food, the sargassum mat creates a three-dimensional world. It has a canopy, a middle layer of fronds, and a shadowed underside where particles accumulate and currents move more slowly. Animals that would be completely exposed in open water are suddenly hidden. Prey that would have nowhere to hunt now has ambush angles and corners. The mat is not just shelter, it is architecture, and life has learned to use that architecture in extraordinary ways. Hatchling sea turtles, newly emerged from beaches on distant coastlines, make for open water and then find the weed lines, resting and feeding among the fronds in what researchers have called their lost years. The early phase of life that was once so difficult to study because the turtles simply vanished into the gyre. They were here all along, tucked into the sargassum, eating small invertebrates and floating with the current. Juvenile eels, including the young of the European and American eel, pass through the Sargasso early in their lives, using the mats for cover during a journey that will eventually carry them to the rivers and lakes of two continents. Shrimp and small crabs cling to the fronds, some of them colored in patterns so similar to the algae that they nearly disappear into it, their camouflage the product of long evolutionary negotiation between predator and prey. Then there is the sargassum fish, a creature so committed to its habitat that it has become almost indistinguishable from it. Its body is textured and patterned to match the algae precisely, its fins modified into structures that look like fronds. Its movements a careful mimicry of the way the weed shifts in a current. It uses modified fins to walk among the fronds rather than swim through open water, and it waits for smaller animals to come close enough to swallow. It is an animal that has become the plant, at least to look at, and it lives nowhere else. Remove the sargassum and you remove the sargassum fish, because the two are a single system. What makes this mobile habitat so valuable is exactly the quality that might seem like a disadvantage. The mats move. They travel with the current shifting position over days and weeks, pulled by wind and water into new configurations. Edges that were connected come apart in a storm and drift separately before finding other mats and locking together again, like pieces of a puzzle that is constantly being disassembled and rebuilt. This dynamism means the habitat is never static. Its internal structure changes, the shadows shift, new surfaces are exposed, old ones are buried. For the animals living within it, this requires adaptability and also creates opportunity. Following the mat means following a moving refuge across an ocean that would otherwise offer nothing comparable. In a sparse pelagic world, a shifting island of structure is still an island, and an island surrounded by open ocean becomes extraordinarily precious. The mats also concentrate small organisms, particles of food, tiny invertebrates and larvae that are drawn to the shade and the physical complexity of the fronds. The food web within the sargassum community is denser and more layered than anything in the surrounding blue water. It is not a tropical reef, but it follows a similar logic. Structure generates diversity, and diversity generates more structure, until the mat becomes self-sustaining in a way that the open ocean around it is not to float beneath one of these canopies, and look upward is to see something that the rest of the open ocean cannot offer. The amber light filtering down through the fronds, the small shapes moving at the edges of the mat, the occasional flash of something silver turning in the shadows. It is quiet in the way that forests are quiet, not silent, but contained with the sounds and movements of life muffled by the density of the vegetation above. The Sargasso Sea named itself after this plant, and the plant earned that naming by turning bare water into something that breathes. For the first people who wrote about this place, the weed was not just habitat, it was a landmark. Centuries before satellites traced the gyre, mariners from Portugal were sailing westward into waters that felt less and less familiar. They saw the same floating fronds, the same golden rafts stretching to the horizon, and they gave the region a name drawn from what they saw. In their language, Sargasso referred to this kind of grape-like seaweed with its bead-like air bladders. Over time, the word shifted and spread, becoming Sargasso in other tongues. An entire sea defined not by coasts or islands, but by the presence of a drifting plant. Naming something does not mean you understand it. It just means you can point to it in conversation. For those early sailors, the Sargasso Sea was partly a navigational clue and partly a warning. Crossing into thick mats of weed meant you had entered a different kind of water, a region where the usual mental maps were less reliable. To people accustomed to coasts and known currents, a weed-choked open ocean could feel like stepping into a story before anyone had agreed on its plot. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus crossed this part of the Atlantic, he left behind a written trace of his own encounter. His journal mentions the floating seaweed as something notable enough to record. The ships moved through stretches where the water's surface was crowded with the brown algae, and Columbus remarked on how dense it could be. Later retellings sometimes lean hard on the drama, imagining the crew gripped by fear that the weed would entangle their hull, seize the rudder, and hold them fast in a grip of vegetation. The surviving accounts are more restrained. They suggest caution rather than panic. The sailors had practical reasons to be uneasy. Dense mats of sargassum could muffle the look of the water, hiding subtle changes in color that might hint at shoals. A calm spell in the winds, always a concern in the age of sail, could feel more ominous when it arrived in a place where the sea already looked unusual. Becalmed in a field of floating plants, your ship motionless under a blank sky, it would not be hard for the mind to decorate the scene with possibilities. Was the ship slowing because of the wind, or because the ocean itself had turned sluggish and thick? If you did not understand gyres and current systems, it might feel as if you had crossed into a patch of ocean that behaved by different rules. Stories grow well in such conditions. As more voyages crossed and recrossed the Atlantic, the Sargasso Sea developed a reputation among some sailors as a strange, still region, a place where ships could wander, fall into calm, and take longer than expected to emerge. Logs and journals usually framed this in practical terms: uncooperative winds, puzzling currents, weeds fouling lines. But oral traditions did what oral traditions do. They gathered the unusual details and polished them. By the time popular writers in the 19th and 20th centuries turned their attention to maritime mysteries, the Sargasso Sea already carried a faint haze of reputation. It was described as a sea of weeds, a dead calm where derelict ships might drift for years. Later, as the idea of the Bermuda Triangle took hold in magazines and paperbacks, the Sargasso often appeared in the background of those stories, another ingredient in a recipe for unease. A region of odd currents and floating tangles of vegetation became, in some retellings, a stage for vanishings and unexplained delays. Modern historians tend to separate these layers. On one side, there is the physical Sargasso Sea, a gyre-defined region, sometimes calm at the surface, often crowded with sargassum, with currents that can trap floating objects for long spans. On the other side, there is the cultural Sargasso, a mental landscape built from sailor anecdotes, imaginative fiction, and later the hunger for mysteries that sell. The first is an object of oceanography and ecology. The second belongs to folklore, useful for understanding how people frame uncertainty, but not evidence of anything supernatural lurking in the water. Seen this way, the legends are less about a haunted sea and more about how humans respond to environments that feel indifferent and vast. A ship in the middle of the gyre, surrounded on all sides by horizon, hemmed in at close range by an unfamiliar floating forest, might as well be on another planet. It is easy to understand why a place like that would collect stories. It is also important to remember that the stories are stories. The Sargasso Sea can strand a vessel through the simple combination of light winds, looping currents, and human error. It does not need anything more exotic. While one tradition of thinking about this sea fixated on its surface strangeness, another, much later, turned downward. In the early 20th century, the Sargasso became a gateway not to folklore, but to depth, off Bermuda, near the gyre's western edge. A natural laboratory existed, deep water close to shore, relative accessibility from land, and the backdrop of this weed-dotted sea. It was here, between 1930 and 1934, that William Beebe and engineer Otis Barton began lowering a steel sphere into the blue. The device was called a bathysphere, and its design was almost austere, a thick steel ball, bolted shut, with a small quartz window only a few inches across. Inside, cramped and hot, Beebe would sit with instruments and a notebook while winches on the ship above paid out cable, letting the sphere sink hundreds of meters. The line between him and the surface was literally a cable and a telephone wire, carrying his spoken observations upward in real time. Before these dives, much of what scientists thought they knew about deep-sea life came from nets hauled from the dark, their contents damaged and distorted by the journey up. Creatures from pressure-crushed depths arrived as ragged suggestions. Beebe's bathysphere changed that, hanging in black water off Bermuda, technically still within the larger Sargasso region. He watched living animals move in their own environment. Lanternfish, jellyfish, strange transparent forms, points of bioluminescence flicking on and off like signals in an unknown code. He described colors that vanished as nets rose, behaviors that could never have been guessed from preserved specimens. Those descents were not record-breaking by modern standards. Depth estimates from different accounts vary, but they reached several hundred meters and in later dives far deeper than any person had gone in a similar craft. What mattered was not the number, but the shift in method. For the first time, a human eye was deliberately stationed in the midwater darkness of the open ocean, watching rather than scraping. Beebe dictated everything he saw to the surface, where assistants wrote and sketched as he spoke. Later, artists turned his words into detailed illustrations, trying to capture animals that no one else had ever seen alive. Radio broadcasts carried his impressions to listeners far away, translating a narrow view through a small window into broad public imagination. The Sargasso Sea, once a patch of troublesome weed on the route to somewhere else, became, in these accounts, an entrance hall to an immense interior. The impact on ocean science was subtle at first, then profound. Beebe's work suggested that deep pelagic zones were not empty, but busy layered ecosystems. It hinted that bioluminescence was common, that many species followed daily vertical migrations, that the apparent emptiness of the open ocean was an artifact of our tools, not of the water itself. Future submersibles and remotely operated vehicles would extend this approach, but the bathysphere showed it was possible. For the Sargasso Sea, this marked a kind of reclassification. Mariners had long marked it on charts as a region to note for currents and weed. Writers had marked it in stories as a place of uneasy calm. Beebe, and those who followed, began to mark it as a scientific address, a place where you could go to look down instead of just across. The same gyre that gathered sargassum at the surface also offered a stable platform above great depth, making it a natural site to study the vertical dimension of the ocean. From that point on, the Sargasso Sea was no longer just a peculiar patch of Atlantic spotted with brown algae and burdened with rumors. It was also a window, a place where early navigators named what floated, where later storytellers embroidered what might be lost, and where a steel sphere hanging on a cable allowed us, briefly, to peer into the vast dark beneath the rafts and discover that the real mysteries were not in ship disappearances or haunted weeds, but in the quiet, continuous life unfolding far below the light. If you return in your mind to the golden mats at the surface, it is easy to think of them as the whole story. The sargassum is what you see. It is what sailors wrote about and what satellite images now trace across the gyre. But beneath those rafts, the Sargasso Sea is running an almost invisible engine, one that takes sunlight, water, and drifting plant tissue and turns them into motion in the carbon cycle. For an oligotrophic ocean, the Sargasso is unexpectedly busy. Across the upper 100 or so meters, primary productivity has climbed in recent decades. Measurements between the late 1990s and the mid-2000s suggest that integrated production from the surface down to roughly 140 meters nearly doubled. That means more carbon is being fixed from dissolved inorganic form into organic matter, both by the familiar microscopic phytoplankton and by the sargassum itself, which behaves like a forest of free-floating leaves. When you think of carbon leaving the surface and heading downward, there are two broad pathways that scientists emphasize here. One is simple to picture. The other is almost entirely abstract, unless you're used to thinking at microbial scales. The straightforward pathway is sinking algal material. Pieces of sargassum break away from the rafts. Some fronds die, lose buoyancy, and begin to fall. In storms, mats can be torn apart and fragments pushed under. Each sinking strand is a small package of carbon that had been held in the light and is now moving into the dimmer layers below. As it drops through the upper water column, it joins a larger rain of particles: fecal pellets, dead plankton, clumps of organic debris. Instruments set at about 150 meters in the Sargasso have recorded that this particulate organic carbon export has risen as well, increasing by more than half over the same period that surface productivity climbed. It is as if the conveyor belt carrying carbon downward has sped up. From there, you might imagine that the story is one of quiet burial: more material produced at the surface, more material slipping into the deep, more long-term storage of carbon in the abyss. But the Sargasso Sea does not let particles fall unchallenged. Between the sunlit surface and the deep, much of that organic matter meets the second pathway, the microbial loop. The phrase sounds technical, but the idea is intimate. Bacteria and other tiny organisms patrol the water column, feeding on dissolved and particulate organic carbon. They break complex molecules apart, respire some of the carbon back into carbon dioxide, and turn some into their own biomass. Other microbes and small grazers then consume them. Carbon moves through these cycles many times before any residue has a chance to sink out of reach. In the Sargasso Sea, clues from time series stations hint at how powerful this loop can be. Even as more particulate carbon leaves the surface around 150 meters, measurements deeper down, closer to 300 meters, do not show a matching increase in flux. Somewhere between those levels, much of the extra material is being intercepted, transformed and respired. Estimates of bacterial carbon demand in the mesopelagic, the twilight zone below the surface mixing layer, have shifted too. Where microbes once seemed to require roughly twice the carbon that could be explained by the loss of particles with depth, more recent numbers suggest that demand has fallen to about half that earlier value. The details are complex and interpretations differ, but the pattern implies a dynamic balance. More material is sent down, but microbial communities are highly effective at reworking it before it sinks into the long-term archive. That loop is not driven only by the obvious players. In 2024, when researchers sequenced the genetic material of viruses and their hosts in the Sargasso Sea using long-read metagenomics, they uncovered a viral community that had been largely hidden. Within relatively small volumes of water, they identified 2,301 distinct viral populations. Nearly half of them, around 951, appear to be endemic to this gyre. They do not show up in the same way in global surveys of ocean viruses. Each population is itself genetically varied, with high microdiversity, small changes in sequence spread across many individuals. It is a reminder that even when you think you have named something, you have not captured its full range. Viruses in the ocean are often introduced in simple terms. They infect cells, they burst them, and in doing so they release organic material that other microbes can consume. This is sometimes called the viral shunt, a diversion of carbon from the neat route of sinking particles back into the dissolved pool that feeds the microbial loop. In that picture, more viral activity means more recycling near the surface and less efficient export to the deep. In the Sargasso Sea, though, the new data complicate the story. Many of the viral populations found seem to be unique to this region, and their genetic patterns show fine-scale variation that suggests ongoing adaptation within the particular conditions of the gyre. At the same time, some of the viruses that scientists expected to find in abundance are surprisingly rare. In other parts of the open ocean, certain bacterial lineages dominate the plankton. One of the most common is a group called SAR11. Viruses that infect SAR11, known as pelagiphages, have become model systems for understanding virus-host interaction in oligotrophic seas. In the Sargasso metagenomic data, however, classic pelagiphages are scarcely detected. Even one of the best-studied pelagiphages, a virus labeled HTVC01TP, fails to reach standard thresholds for reliable detection. Similarly, only a small number of typical cyanophage marker genes, viruses that infect cyanobacteria like Prochlorococcus, another key open ocean player, appear in the sequences. That absence is not the same as proof that these infections do not occur, but it suggests that the virus-host dynamics here differ from what has been seen elsewhere. Perhaps SAR11 and other dominant bacteria in the Sargasso are under less intense lytic viral pressure than in comparable waters. Perhaps viruses rely more on persistent infections, temporary dormancy, or host ranges that do not match our current expectations. The metagenomic snapshots also show that the viral community does not always track the composition of the cellular community in a simple way. The two can be partially decoupled, with viral types persisting even as host populations fluctuate and vice versa. All of this matters because viruses can, in principle, strongly influence how nutrients and carbon move through the system. When a virus lyses a cell, it turns what might have become a sinking particle into a plume of dissolved organic carbon and small debris. That material is easily reabsorbed into the microbial loop, fueling bacterial growth and respiration rather than contributing directly to deep-sea storage. In nutrient-poor waters like the Sargasso, such recycling can also liberate nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace elements, keeping them available in the upper layers where photosynthesis can continue. Yet the exact scale of this influence in the Sargasso Sea is still uncertain. Some studies in oligotrophic waters suggest that viral populations can turn over on timescales of a couple of days, hinting at very active infection and release. The 2024 work, though, is based on limited time windows, a few days of sampling in one season. From such brief glimpses, it is difficult to infer long-term rates of infection, lysis, and carbon shunting. When researchers compare the viral assemblages in particle-associated fractions with those in the surrounding water, they see differences, but translating those patterns into firm numbers for how much carbon is retained, respired, or exported remains a challenge. The same is true for the balance between the two main pathways below the Sargassum rafts. We know that more carbon has been flowing downward at mid-depth, and we know that deep fluxes have not increased in lockstep. We know that microbial communities, aided and perhaps modulated by viruses, are actively reprocessing organic matter along the way. What we do not yet know with confidence is how much of the Sargassum's contribution ends as long-term sequestration in the deep ocean and how much is returned to the atmosphere on human timescales through respiration in the twilight zone. In that sense, the gyre's engine is partly exposed and partly veiled. We can see that the Sargassum forest feeds it by boosting primary production, shedding fragments, and leaking dissolved compounds into the water around it. We can glimpse how bacteria and archaea pick up that material, how their demand for carbon has shifted as conditions have changed. We can now name thousands of viral populations, many of them apparently native to this sea with no shore, and we can speculate about the roles they play in nutrient recycling and carbon routing. But the functional impacts are still written in a language we are just beginning to learn. Without long, continuous time series of viral and microbial activity, our ideas about turnover rates and shunt strength remain hypotheses, grounded in data yet stretching beyond what the data can fully support. In a way, the situation echoes the old stories of ships among the weed. Observers sensed that something distinctive was happening in this part of the ocean. They gave it a name, attached narratives, and then filled in the gaps with what they had. Now, instead of sailors' tales, we have metagenomes and flux measurements. Instead of fear of entangling weed, we have questions about the fine balance between recycling and sequestration. The Sargasso Sea's invisible engine continues to run, powered by light at the surface and by microscopic exchanges below, while we try to catch up, turning brief, careful measurements into a coherent plot. And as that engine hums along, the conditions that feed it are beginning to change. The floating forest itself is not as stable as it once seemed, and the patterns of warmth and nutrients that shape life in the gyre are shifting. The story of how this sea moves carbon may be entering a new chapter. Change in the Sargasso Sea does not announce itself with a crashing wave on rock. There is no tidal line to creep upward, no eroding cliff to watch. Instead, the shift shows up as a thinning of something that floats, a quiet loss spread across water that looks from far away the same as it always has. Since about 2015, that loss has become harder to ignore. When scientists began comparing new satellite records with older ones, they saw a pattern that startled them. In the northern Sargasso Sea, the very area that gave this region its name, the biomass of sargassum appeared to have fallen by more than 90%. On a map made from those data, the once dense ribbons and patches of weed in the northern gyre fade almost to nothing. A forest that used to drift across the surface starts to look like scattered shrubs. For a place defined in the popular imagination by floating brown algae, the idea that most of that algae could have vanished in a decade feels almost surreal. But the story is not that simple, and the ocean rarely yields a single clean number. Satellite estimates rely on how sargassum mats change the color and brightness of the sea surface. They are powerful because they see everything, scanning wide swaths of the gyre every few days. At the same time, they see only the top, and only what clears the threshold of detection. Small, broken clumps and thin layers can slip under the radar. Literally, shipboard surveys offer a different view. Researchers on vessels still find sargassum in the northern gyre. When they tally what they see along their tracks and compare it to earlier cruises, they estimate something closer to a 50% decline. That is not a gentle change. It is still a severe reduction. Yet, it is only about half as extreme as the satellite picture. The gap between more than 90% and around 50% is not just a technical detail, it is a reminder of how hard it is to measure a living, shifting habitat in the open ocean. Satellites might underestimate biomass by missing submerged or patchy weed. Ships might overestimate it if they happen to cross the denser remaining bands. Neither method is wrong, Each is a partial perspective. Together, they bracket the truth somewhere between a halving and a near disappearance of sargassum in the northern Sargasso. Once the change was recognized, the next question followed. Why now? One line of evidence points upstream to the Gulf of Mexico. Much of the sargassum that historically fed the northern gyre passed through this warm basin on its journey, carried by currents that eventually merge into the Gulf Stream and flow into the Sargasso Sea. Sargassum does not thrive at any temperature. It seems to prefer a band roughly between 23 and 28 degrees Celsius. Within that range it can grow, repair damage, and make the long trip. In recent years, surface waters in the Gulf of Mexico have spent more and more time above that comfortable band. Heat waves and a general warming trend push temperatures into levels that stress the algae. A mat that might once have drifted through the Gulf, like a traveler on a long but manageable road, now finds itself in water that is sometimes more like a kiln. Fronds bleach, cells fail to keep up with repair, and mortality climbs. Imagine a relay where the baton is the sargassum itself. If too many runners falter in the Gulf, fewer healthy mats reach the northern gyre. The supply line weakens, not because the Sargasso Sea changed its currents, but because the path leading into it has become consistently hotter. Temperature is only part of the story. Nutrients matter too, and in the open Atlantic, they are already scarce. The Sargasso Sea is famously oligotrophic, a place where nitrogen, phosphorus, and other key elements are in short supply. Sargassum has tricks for surviving under those conditions, recycling efficiently, drawing on what little is available. Yet even a tough plant has limits here. The Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt enters the picture. Since around 2011, massive, recurring blooms of sargassum have appeared across a 9-kilometer swath of the tropical and subtropical Atlantic, from the coast of West Africa across to the Caribbean and into the Gulf of Mexico. This belt is not the Sargasso Sea, though the same species of algae are involved. It is a mobile, climate-sensitive feature of the wider ocean. As the belt has expanded and intensified, it has begun to behave like a vast biological sponge for nutrients. Sargassum growing earlier in the belt takes up phosphorus, nitrogen, and other dissolved chemicals as it blooms. When those mats die, sink, or wash ashore, much of that nutrient stock is removed from the water. By the time currents carrying remnants from the belt feed into the Gulf of Mexico, the water itself can be poorer in phosphorus than it used to be. The sargassum arriving there might face both hotter temperatures and leaner nutrient conditions. Under that combination of heat stress and limitation, growth slows, resilience drops, and losses increase. Fewer robust mats make the final leg into the northern Sargasso Sea. So as the northern gyre sees its sargassum wane, other parts of the Atlantic are seeing something like the opposite. Caribbean beaches buried under rotting algae, near-shore ecosystems smothered by thick brown tangles. Satellite images of the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt highlight years where blooms sprawl across the tropics in unprecedented quantities, fueled by shifting circulation, river outflows, and warming trends. It is a striking contrast. A namesake sea quietly losing much of its floating forest, while an Atlantic belt of the same algae grows into a recurrent nuisance and a symptom of larger change. The total amount of sargassum in the basin may not be vanishing. It may be redistributing, pulled and pushed by heat and nutrients into new patterns that serve some regions with excess and others with scarcity. For the Sargasso Sea itself, the stakes go beyond the presence or absence of weed on the surface. The rafts support hatchling turtles, juvenile fish, shrimp, crabs, and invertebrates that depend on the structure and shelter of the mats. Fewer mats mean fewer places to hide, feed, and grow. The floating rainforest shrinks, and with it the associated community. The invisible engine below the rafts feels the change as well. Less sargassum in the northern gyre can mean less organic material leaking, shedding, and eventually sinking into the upper twilight zone. That in turn can alter the diet of bacteria, archaea, and the diverse viruses that interact with them. In a system where viral infection, lysis, and recycling already complicate the pathways of carbon, changing the initial input can ripple through the whole web. Warmer waters do not just affect sargassum physiology, they can shift stratification, the layering of the ocean, which controls how nutrients from deeper layers mix upward. A more strongly layered water column tends to keep deep nutrients locked below the sunlit surface. In such a scenario, both microscopic phytoplankton and the sargassum itself encounter more severe nutrient limitation. At the same time, viral communities already distinctive in the Sargasso Sea may respond sensitively to changes in temperature, host abundance, and chemistry. Some viral populations might become more active, increasing the recycling of organic carbon and further reducing the fraction that sinks. Others might decline if their preferred hosts become rarer. The balance between the viral shunt and particle export could tilt, altering how much carbon this gyre sends into long-term storage versus how much it returns to the atmosphere over human timescales. Food webs adjust, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. A decrease in sargassum may push certain fish and invertebrates to other habitats, if they exist, or reduce their numbers. Predators that once relied on sargassum-associated prey might shift diets or ranges. Even microbes and viruses, too small to see, participate in this reorganization, each responding to a changing template of temperature, nutrients, and carbon supply. From a distance, the Sargasso Sea still looks like a broad patch of blue on a map, bounded by currents rather than shores. Its lack of coastline can make it seem abstract, as if it were more a pattern in circulation than a place. Yet the recent decline in its floating forest reveals how physical change elsewhere, in the Gulf of Mexico, in the tropical belt, in the atmosphere overhead, can reach into the heart of this gyre and rewrite its ecology. The uncertainty in the exact numbers does not erase the trend. Whether the northern Sargasso has lost half or more than 9/10 of its sargassum, the direction is clear. A system that once seemed stable on human timescales is, in fact, fragile, contingent on narrow ranges of temperature and the delicate budget of nutrients in an open ocean. A sea with no coastline can still be wounded. It can still be reshaped by decisions and emissions far from its center, by invisible gases accumulating in the air, by heat absorbed in places few people ever see. The Sargasso Sea, famous for its stillness and its drifting weed, is not a fixed stage set. It is a living, changing part of the planet, entering a new chapter while we are just beginning to understand the old ones. If you have been listening as you fall asleep, or as you work, or as you travel, and your thoughts have drifted with this sea without shores, you are now part of its story too, simply by knowing it exists and that it is changing. If you found this journey through the Sargasso Sea calming or thought-provoking, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Let me know where in the world you are listening from, and which part of this ocean without a coastline stayed with you the most.